Welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming. I wanted to extend a special word of thanks, especially to our outside responders for agreeing to this role, which was very supererogatory of you. Many of you came in at the last minute. Welcome. I'd also like to extend a special word of thanks to Julie Maxwell, who's hosting our Zoom meeting, and she's done most of the heavy lifting in terms of bringing this conference together. So thank you very much, Julie. This event represents the culmination of the efforts of a year-long graduate student working group composed of Duke and UNC students in various disciplines who are working in some way at the intersection of immigration and religion. Students have met monthly throughout the school year to develop their projects and receive feedback from the collegial environment of the working group. This conference will allow them to share their work with the greater Duke-UNC community as well as with each other once again. I've been part of a few thematic working groups of this nature. This is my first time as coordinator. I just wanted to say once again, I'm incredibly impressed by the quality of work this year, and I hope that you all will be as well. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to our faculty coordinator, Malachi, for him to say a few words, and then we'll go ahead and begin with the first panel.
So thank you, Ilza. So I'm Malachi Cohen, and I'm the director of the Religions and Public Life Initiative at the Kenan Institute for Ethics, and a professor of history, political science, and religion. And each year we have a graduate group working on a topic that is of both scholarly and public significance. And we look for an interdisciplinary group that will try and have a plurality of approaches to the same question on the public agenda with the hope of developing an interdisciplinary conversation and possibly a vision, a public one and a scholarly one. And the end of the year conference represents the results of this work. The work would have been impossible if not for the continuous support, financial support of the Kenan Institute for Ethics, and Jeremy Butte has been supporting the group throughout the year, but it also represents the collaboration with the Duke Center for Middle Eastern Studies with Dumesk. And I wanted to thank Ellen McLarney, the director of the program, and Julie Maxwell for being such a wonderful coordinator of the final workshop, and for the collaboration and support. The program is also supported by the Jewish Studies program. And I think that you will not find many universities in which the Middle Eastern Studies Institute and the Jewish Studies Center collaborate so closely as they do in this project, especially when it comes to visions about the future of the Middle East. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm also grateful for Ilza for so ably coordinating the group. I'm grateful for all of our very resourceful graduate students who have participated in the deliberation throughout the year and who are going to be presenting the work today. And finally, I wanted to thank the respondents who have come to comment on people's work. Professor Susan Pennybacker from UNC Chapel Hill, Professor Bruce Lawrence from Duke University, and Dr. Matthew Kresslers from the College of Charleston. To all of them, very many thanks. I very much look forward to today's conference. And as you shall see, I will be taking a very active part. Let's go.
Thank you very much, Malachi, for that wonderful introduction, especially in so much detail. I'd really like to reiterate everything that Malachi has said and go ahead and present our first panel. Unfortunately, one of the members of this panel which I am also on, was unable to make it here today because of the family emergency. So I will be presenting for him and just saying a few words on what he presented a couple weeks ago at our last seminar meeting. I'm just going to go ahead and let Nurlan, the first member of our panel, speak first, and then I'm going to present for myself and for Perry Schweitzer. Very quickly, I want to introduce all the members of this panel, as well as our respondent, Professor Susan Pennybacker at UNC Chapel Hill. Nurlan Kebdilhak is a history PhD student at UNC Chapel Hill, and he works on the Russian imperial state and its Muslim subjects. I am Elsa Costa. I am leading the Duke History PhD program this term, and I'm going to be presenting on early modern xenophobia in Spain. And Perry, who's a PhD student in religion at Duke, Perry Schweitzer, was going to present on the relationship between religion and citizenship in the US in the context of the sanctuary movement. Professor Pennybacker will respond. She's Distinguished Professor of European History at Chapel Hill. So I'm going to go ahead and let Nurlan take it from here. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Elsa. My name is Nurlan Kebdilhak. I'm a PhD student, History Department at UNC Chapel Hill. Let me share my slides. Oh, screen sharing is disabled. All right, I don't have to slide actually. Share my slides in. All right, so today I will talk about the phenomenon of Chala Kazakhs in the 19th century Kazakh steppe. Oh, I can share my slides now. Yeah, right here. And this phenomenon existed in the second half of the 19th century in the Kazakh steppe, when this region was more and more was becoming integrated more and more into the Russian Empire under its administrative and military institutions. And Chala in Central Asian context would mean half or incomplete. So this would mean this would make this term Chala Kazakhs as half or incomplete Kazakhs. Now, as a rule, this term Chala Kazakhs was historically used in relation to the descendants of Kazakh mothers and non-Kazakh fathers, and due to patrilineal inheritance of one ethnic or tribal identity in Central Asia, this progeny of non-Kazakh fathers were left outside of traditional Kazakh tribal genealogies. That's why they could not be considered fully Kazakh. But because they were living among the Kazakhs, speaking Kazakh language, this term, this phenomenon of Chala Kazakhs or half Kazakhs emerged. After several generations, however, and we know a number of cases, these Chala Kazakhs could be eventually integrated as a branch of Kazakh tribal genealogical tree and loses Chala status and become fully Kazakh. And I'm showing you this one of this tribal genealogical tree of the Naiman tribe of the Kazakhs, and their tribe known as the Bajigits, who were originally of non-Kazakh origin, eventually after 4 or 5 generations were integrated into the Naiman genealogical tree. This social phenomenon existed before the 19th century, before, again, the Russian imperial expansion to Central Asia. However, before that, it was quite limited in scope. And only with the Russian expansion, we can observe the further development and rapid growth of this phenomenon. And this expansion leads to the emergence of what one can call the fake Chala Kazakhs, those who from both of their parent sides didn't belong to Kazakhs, but those who had different incentives to be recognized by the Tsarist state as such. And this expansion of this phenomenon of the Chala Kazakhs was a product of the migration of various Muslim, Turkic-speaking communities to the Kazakh steppe. I'm, in my presentation, focusing on one particular community, the so-called Tatars, who come from the Volga-Ural region in the Russian Empire, mostly from what was the Kazan province and what is today the Tatar or Tatarstan Republic in Russia. And these people known as Tatars today, though historically in Central Asia, they were known as Nogais. Kazan, the capital city of Tatarstan, would be conquered by the Russian state in the mid-16th century by Ivan the Terrible, who was Tsar of what was back then the Muscovite Russia. Some would consider this as the first imperial conquest of Russia, again in the mid-16th century. By the 19th century, this region was fully integrated to Russia proper. And those Tatars who started migrating to the Kazakh steppe in the early 19th century or even in the late 18th century were driven by different pull and push factors. Again, some were attracted by new commercial opportunities. Some were sent by Russia as administrators or clerks. Some were sent as Muslim clergy. Some were trying to escape persecution from non-Muslim state as they were seeing Russia. It appears, however, that many of them, or perhaps most of these Tatars, were trying to avoid military service in the Russian army. And this service in the Russian army was quite harsh in the pre-Great Reforms era in Russian history. So if one is going to the Russian army, this person has to serve for 25 years, again, before the second half of the 19th century. And this often meant that if one is conscripted to Russian army, there are a lot of chances that this person would die as a soldier without seeing his family ever again. Not necessarily due to wars that Russia was fighting, but due to natural causes, given that a life expectancy in Russia in the mid-19th century was less than 30 years for men. At the same time, Central Asians and Kazakhs among them were excluded from this duty to serve in the Russian army because they were seen as not completely loyal. So Tatars, most of the Tatars would be categorized as peasants by Russia, and Kazakhs and other Central Asians would be categorized as the so-called inorodцы, or if we are to translate this term, of alien origin. So those Tatars who would relocate to Kazakh steppe, trying to avoid Russian army, some of them would become merchants. Many of them, however, had religious education, so they would serve as a Muslim clergy in the Kazakh steppe. When starting from the 1820s, Russia decided to integrate the Kazakh steppe closely. It created these new administrative institutions in the Kazakh steppe and tried to regulate the movement of people. They faced a legal dilemma. Again, they met these people who were calling themselves as Tatars or the children of Tatars, but who were living in the Kazakh steppe. So if Russia recognizes people as Tatars, then they would have to send them to the Russian army. They had to tax them differently, but they couldn't categorize them again as Kazakhs as well because they were excluded from Kazakh genealogical structures. So Russian state adopted the term Chala Kazakhs instead as a legal category now. And by doing this, they equated Chala Kazakhs legally with Kazakhs. So from the point of view of the state, they were equal. And this all happening in the 1920s. Soon, however, this decision led to unforeseen consequences. We see expansion of this phenomenon of the Chala Kazakhs. Again, there are a lot of cases when people of non-Kazakh origin from both of their parents' side come to Kazakh steppe and try to claim and petition the Russian state to be recognized as Chala Kazakhs. And I, in my paper, focus on one particular person, religious scholar Qurban Ali Khalidi, who was born a Chala Kazakh in the Kazakh steppe in 1846. He is known as an author of a number of historical and religious works. He served as an imam in eastern Kazakhstan and later in eastern Turkestan in Xinjiang area of China. Both of his parents were Tatars from the Kazan province. However, his father successfully forged his Chala-Kazakh identity and petitioned the Russian administration and was recognized as Chala-Kazakh. And his father passed on this status to his children, to Qurban Ali Khalidi as well. And there are many, many, many cases like this again. After 1860, however, or around 1860, Russian administration decides to intervene in this uncontrolled process by now. So Tsarist general governor orders to reject the category of Chala-Kazakhs altogether because there are a lot of people coming, trying to forge his identity, trying to stay in the Kazakh steppe. And he orders to re-register all Chala-Kazakhs simply as Kazakhs now, and not to admit the new Chala-Kazakhs anymore. So we see the gradual decrease of this phenomenon in the second half of the 19th century, although here and there we can still observe people claiming Chala status, petitioning the Russian state, and sometimes successful. To conclude, I would just say that Chala-Kazakhs present a fascinating case that on one hand exposes ethnic processes in pre-colonial and colonial environment, Central Asia. It also illuminates many aspects of Russian empire building, highlighting particularly how state policy can cause a chain of reactions that affects political, legal, and ethnic processes in the empire's domains. This phenomenon also illustrates the agency of Muslim subjects under the Russian rule, who themselves made a decision to either engage or disengage with the Tsarist state, and who tried to seize opportunities offered by the imperial expansion. That will be all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. I'm going to save the applause for the end of the panel and just go ahead and continue with my own presentation. My technical issues are fortunately over, so I do have slides, although it's images. But I wanted to talk about something that I wrote about for a think piece for this working group. There's sort of an end of year think piece that we post on the website, but I'm hoping perhaps to develop this into a larger article. So I'm using this panel discussion partly as a workshop for that. I'm going to start with a lot of information that some of you are already pretty familiar with, and then just sort of talk about my intervention very, very briefly, since these are meant to be very brief presentations. But this is the image here. You've got Ferdinand and Isabella, who married to unite Spain in the late 1400s. In 1492, you have the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Umayyad Caliphate, which ends. And for the first time in Spanish history, resident Jews and Muslims are told en masse to convert or leave, and a majority convert and a minority leaves the peninsula. So for the next 30 to 50 years, as a result of this sort of semi-forced conversion, there is this intense prejudice against the converts, which emanates sort of from the Spanish Inquisition. There's the suspicion that these are not good enough converts, whether for cultural reasons or for religious reasons. And this mixture of culture and religion is really what I want to home in on in the course of this presentation. So, of course, you have the state and the Inquisition sort of systematically harassing people and occasionally executing them on the basis of Jewish or Arab, Berber ancestry under the presumption or pretense that they're secretly practicing Judaism or Islam. Racially exclusionary laws based on whether you're a new Christian or an old Christian begin to be passed by small businesses in certain branches of the church and the state. So in the case of converts from Islam from southern Spain, their descendants get sort of ghettoized. They live in these small ethnic Arab and Berber communities, mostly in the south of Spain. And at first, they're allowed to keep their traditional way of dress and to hear Arabic masses, as Christians in Malta and the Holy Land did and still do. And this is sort of, I've got a few pictures of their traditional way of dress. However, especially as they start migrating outside the south of Spain and people from other places in Spain start migrating to the south of Spain, these so-called Moriscos, which is Spanish for the Moorish, these Moorish people are despised by the ethnically Spanish community. The way they dress, the music they listen to comes under intense criticism, and you have these sort of roving bands of young men who harass them, beat them up, pull the women's hijabs off, heritage Christians who think that these people are stealing Spanish jobs. So the heritage Christian middle class increasingly starts to petition local governments as well as the federal government for the Moriscos to be deported, quote unquote, back to North Africa, which is not where they're from. However, this movement against these new Christians, basically on the basis of ancestry or race, produces its outburst in a sort of rearticulation of Christian universalism. You have educated intellectuals, members of the church, Renaissance humanists, who push back against this movement. They say, actually, no, we can't do this. Moriscos are Christians. If we use the state against fellow Christians on ethnic grounds, this will bring down the wrath of God upon us. This is a picture of Pedro de Valencia, late Renaissance humanist. He sees this as sort of an example, this plan to expel the Moriscos from Spain as an example of reason of state or Machiavellianism, which flies in the face of what God wants us to do. Pedro de Valencia says that the church and state have gotten lazy since the Middle Ages in terms of their willingness to invest resources into new Christians. He sees this as partly a result of the kind of superstitious apocalypticism and end of the world thinking, which was produced by the completion of the reconquest and the colonization of the New World. So in the end, the Moriscos are expelled, and a lot of them come back, but their culture is basically annihilated by this mass deportation, quote unquote, back to North Africa. Eventually, they do sort of assimilate into the poor white population, but none of their culture and their particular mass that they listen to in Arabic after the reconquest, all that is gone. And this really is the turning point at which Spain starts to use racially motivated legislation against people, and it spreads also, of course, to the New World. Of course, there was also racial legislation in the New World already, but it really gets ramped out in terms of large movements of people from place to place on ethnic grounds. And this is a turning point. But it also sort of produces this rearticulation of Christian universalism. And this turns up as late as the 1800s at the Parliament of Cadiz, which is Spain's first national parliament that was not convoked by a king. So actually, what's really interesting is that 200 years after the expulsion of the Moriscos, it's actually the Christian conservatives. To be fair, there are still constitutionalists and parliamentarians. Everybody there is some kind of anti-absolutist, but of those anti-absolutists, it's the Christian conservatives who are saying that we need to introduce imperial citizenship, and Black and Indigenous Latin Americans should have it indiscriminately. They should have the vote, representation, free movement to the old world, and so on. And the liberal wing says, no, actually, this is liberalism is something that only elite white males are really capable of undertaking. So actually, that sort of Christian universalism is still there, and liberal secular universalism has not yet appeared. And really, it takes until the Parliament of Cadiz restores Ferdinand VII to the throne in 1813. He imprisons everybody who was involved in the constitutional movement, and he sort of buys off the Catholic Church to put the neo-absolutist state back in place. And this leads to a complete flipping of the political divisions within Spain. And in the 19th century, most Catholics do not have this conception of universalism. They don't condemn racist policies, and secular universalism, the kind that is actually disposed to condemn racism and slavery, just evolves slowly over the course of the 19th century with foreign varieties of liberalism, insofar as it's capable with this repressive neo-absolutist state, which Ferdinand VII puts back. Very quickly, to wrap up, when I teach this period and I talk about the Catholics who went along with these racially exclusionary policies, even if they didn't necessarily agree with them, the students often comment on parallels to, for example, the US evangelical movement's frequent failure to condemn racism, even when racism is not an integral part of their theology. But I think it's really also important, despite the slow slide into religious complacency with racism over the course of several centuries, I think it's important to recognize the resilience of this Christian humanist universalism from its sort of creation in the Renaissance as a backlash against the birth of modern racism through the later Enlightenment in Spain. So I have gone over time to some extent. I just want to very quickly summarize some of the things that Perry was going to say. I'm going to stop sharing screen and just make a few comments about Perry's presentation. I don't have access to his presentation notes, unfortunately, but I'm just going to recap what he presented a few weeks ago at our last meeting. He was really discussing his ongoing fieldwork since 2020 at a sanctuary church in Raleigh, and his experience in particular with one refugee who was sheltered by that church, Eliseo Jimenez. And Perry's work really was trying to get into some of the nitty gritty of the relationship between sanctuary, which he sees as fundamentally religious practice, and state violence, and what are the implications of state violence and sanctuary for modern US citizenship. One point that he made in particular is that refugees are forced to appeal to the state for redress for violence which is perpetuated by the state itself. It places them in an ambivalent position vis-a-vis the state. And not only that, but the state is constantly changing its position based on the turnover of administrations and laws, whereas sanctuary is relatively stable. Eliseo himself, this person who's being offered sanctuary in Raleigh, wrote about his repeated appeals for documentation as quote unquote, like writing a letter to the wind, which is also the title of Perry's presentation. Perry also indicated the tension between using case studies to point to larger trends of structural oppression or violence and the problem of treating real people like Eliseo as mere units of analysis. So Perry ended his presentation with a reflection on consent, which I'm just going to quote verbatim, which is that if consent is an essential component of American citizenship, what does the act of designating a state as free from state violence via deportation do to citizenship? That's really the reflection that he wanted everybody to end with during his presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and end there and turn these things over to our responder, Professor Susan Pennybacker. Thank you so much, Susan.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay, so I'm honored to speak, and I'm going to speak quickly. I'm going to read in the interest of time, and we're just a couple minutes over, but I will, excuse me, try to take my 10 minutes. And I want to thank especially Cynthia Ratting from our department for being here today, and I hope she'll be able to speak on the round. Again, I'm honored. Thank you for having me. So these three impressive and committed research projects appear today under the rubric, The Nation State and Its Others, a session title that immediately lands us in vexed terminological terrain. When did the nation state form arrive is a very long-standing question. And how was it constituted? In the case of Spain, some hold out for its promulgation as late as 1978. How distinct is the nation state form from empire? All three projects emanate from the relationships fostered by and occurring within and at the borders of empires. The 15th to the 19th century of Spain in Elsa's work, the 19th century Tsarist state in Netherlands, and the present day US informal empire in Perry's case. Are these then three cases of imperial nation states? Two of them imperial monarchies, another, the US, a modern federalist democracy with a powerful foreign policy in this hemisphere and globally, a superpower that is more than a nation state? Are we then comparing likenesses over time, and how so? The session title further references the other, and we may ask which others and how was their otherness constituted? Were Morosco's Black Spaniards understood as not white? Were Jews similarly understood as not white as a universal? This is a longstanding question, and from when? Whence the term race in Elsa's narrative and its periodization. Nurland documents Central Asian Muslims as well as Russian Muslims, many in the process of becoming empire subjects, a different category historically from that of citizens. He specifically identifies and follows the episodic Chala Kazakhs. Ethnicity and tribe arise in Nurland's verbiage, but not race. The impact of gender is fierce, but understated in his rendering, and I'm speaking, from my script. Is the Tsarist state racialized in Elsa's terms? Did visible phenotypes differ from amongst the peoples whom Nurland describes? Perry presents the case of the individual, a man, a father, a husband, a Latino, Latinx, Mexican, Mexican-American, refugee, border crosser, illegal alien, undocumented person, and a Christian. Is he white, Hispanic? Is he brown? Finally, are we comparing sufficient likenesses over time to speak to the even larger rubric of this year's keynote, the intersection of immigration and religion? If so, in what aspects, in what qualities did these comparable likenesses inhere? How much precision do our definitional structures and usages require for pointedly historical accuracy, itself discursive and temporal, driven by perception and subjectivity? I turn to each presenter. Elsa's exploration of the Moriscos identifies the first instances of formal racial exclusion in laws promulgated after 1492. She traces the practices of heritage Christians and the persecution of Morisco converts and retournees to Spain, whom Spaniards increasingly regarded as a racial other. She traces their defenders who pled that as the retournees were now Christians, all ought to be tolerated, this in the face of strong movements from the heritage Christians for deportation. The monarchy was seen as politically and historically opportunistic by these critics. Finally, at Cadiz in 1813, Catholic conservatives stood for citizenship for the indigenous, and in Elsa's first use of the term, for the Blacks of the empire. From dissent during the absolutist regime that emerges thereafter grew a critical secular universalism, fostered in dialogue with other external liberalisms. Does it emanate from a religious ontology? No, sorry, I ask, what is the meaning of race within these evolving liberalisms? Does it emanate from a religious ontology, the Jew and the Muslim as racial others? Or is it also, or instead, a function of perceived phenotype, a biological view of race that will be reified by late 19th century eugenics proponents of the right and the left? Further, what role do slavery discourses play for the divided Christians? Is there not an emerging globalized view of race that flows from the long pre-existing perceptions of and encounters with racial others enslaved in the North African and sub-Saharan trades, already visible on a global ocean-borne market, excuse me, and on the Iberian Peninsula as early as the 1440s? Can we then trace the racism against the Moriscos and their descendants to their religious heresy, or to the inherited and shared notions of innate racial inferiority flowing from instilled imperial practice? Do these interests in an epistemological hierarchy appropriated by both pro and anti-slavery liberals, these intersect in that hierarchy? Is its articulation bound to anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim sentiment, or are these separable and increasingly separated persuasions? Finally, what roles, if any, do forms of resistance of the Moriscos, you mentioned very briefly, play in the languages that Elsa is mapping? Nurland's meticulous work on the Chala Kazakhs offers a convincing narrative of the reasons for the absorption of Tatar or Nogai peoples into the majority Kazakh steppe towns in the imperial czarist 19th century. These migrant newcomers had reasons of an economic nature for entering the Kazakh jurisdictions, but they especially did not want to serve in the czarist army. And I note that anti-conscription is a fundamental element of many immigration and exile narratives. But in Central Asia, those men arriving from the Russian Empire in a deeply gendered practice who married Kazakh women were for a time labeled Chala Kazakhs. And in this self-identification and largely accepted practice of naming, where whether marriages were real or not, they escaped an onerous responsibility of imperial subjecthood. In so doing, they enjoyed and accepted assimilation into the dominant Muslim communities to which they arrived as fellow Muslims. So this simplified rendition, my simplified rendition of Nerland's erudite reconstruction poses several questions alongside Elsa's work. First, was this indeed a consistently gendered set of practices that women could not initiate? Second, is this not a case unlike Elsa's in which the binding force that makes migration possible and acceptable to all, even the Russians, is the Muslimness of the migrants and of their receiving communities? Is this not part of Nerland's underlying argument, whereas Elsa posits that conversion bred murderous suspicion that was coupled with what she names as racial difference for both Jews and Muslim converts whose Christianness was disbelieved as inauthentic and disingenuous? The indigenous of the Spanish Empire and the enslaved and free figure only marginally in the discourses that Elsa maps from Spain, at least in this short rendition, while for Nerland, the site of monarchy is itself off stage. Instead, what he also terms provocatively in the longer version that I have, and I'm quoting him, non-militant anti-colonial resistance and Muslim agency successfully confronts aristocracy at the borderlands of an expanding empire, desirous of peaceable rule where manageable. In this respect, religious mutuality allows for imperial subjecthood to be renegotiated for the Chala Kazakhs, whose very existence as an identifiable or imagined subcategory of persons would soon morph into other classificatory designations as the empire expanded. The deep challenges to Tsarism's very existence lay only a few years hence. In 1905 and 1917, military service and the fear and loathing thereof would play a fundamental role in the fate of the Tsarist system, if not of a form of Russian empire itself, which would clearly survive under the Soviets. The case of the Chala Kazakhs at the same time seems very far, in my rough reading here, very far from being a precursor to a struggle for self-determination with relative political autonomy and representation with empire as a kind of goal. Is this instead, Nerland's case, one of a liberalizing and secularizing Islam, or of economic and urban transition in which Muslim identity remains the core existential preoccupation? Perry's journey with Eliseo Jimenez at the Umstead Park UCC Church in Durham poses a deep contemporary rendering of the paradigms I'm struggling with in Elsa's and Nerland's work. His religious conviction is not addressed per se, as I recall in the paper, nor his presumed Catholicism and his host's Protestantism, predominantly white Protestants, I would add. Instead, Perry renders the predicament of Jimenez as a reflection on liberalism's failings, on its incapacity to address the transnational issues of rights and inequalities. In 2021, even the critics of the acquisition of and preservation of rights, those who wish to compromise or abolish them, those who wish to uphold inequality, also see the liberal nation state failing, that is, those on the right. Perry calls out the inadequacy of the citizen-non-citizen binary, and in so doing renders the advances of Cadiz and the Tsarist concessions to the Chala Kazakhs temporary, fleeting, unupheld in the histories that follow, in which Jimenez is himself a player. He is, after all, inheritor of the imperial conflicts of this hemisphere, of the Iberian, English-American transfers of power, and their erections of uncrossable borders, of unnegotiated rights. Is his sanctuary a case of religion and immigration? That is his Christianness and that of his hosts what makes his sanctuary possible? Or Perry's point that Jimenez's sanctuary is unresolved, his case is yet unheard at the moment of writing, seems very significant. Is the shared religious commitment merely opportune and comforting? He may get a better deal because of it, but is his religious embrace a factor in the state's denial of his rights? Is it instead best portrayed by Perry as a factor in the privilege of those who offer him a temporary home, a source of their own spiritual sustenance. I'll just close by saying I have cases, from the modern period that resonate with these papers. I'm just going to mention them extremely quickly. One is the case of the Moors' recruitment to Franco's army during the Spanish Civil War and the racism that the left emanated against the Moorish recruits. Another is my student Erica Huckstein's case of Jewish women who marry German Jews. The Jews who have already citizenship in the UK are not allowed to bring their husbands into Britain because the husbands are the male in the couple. So the deeply gendered nature of that case, a la Nurlan. And also that visa policies, for example, in the UK remain gendered and grandfathered in the post-45 period for a very long time. Your grandparents had to be born in the UK, but only the male could confer citizenship rights to his spouse. And finally, in the South African case, which I'm very preoccupied with right now, it is resistance to conscription by white conscripts to the proxy wars, murderous proxy wars in the southern part of Africa, and the exile of those families of draftees that plays one of the most fundamental roles in the downfall of the apartheid state and Mandela coming to power. So I just mentioned those as kind of contemporary resonances for me. Thank you so very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Susan. That was absolutely supererogatory in every way, and we're all very, very grateful for it. Unfortunately, because I'm one of the major culprits here, but unfortunately, since we did go over time in the presentation, there will not be time for questions. So let's just have a quick round of applause for Nurlan, and let's just go ahead and move on to the next panel. If we want to stay after the entire conference is over for sort of open questions after the official 2:30 ending points, that can also be a possibility. But I want to present the next panel, which is Religion and Representations of Near Eastern Belonging. Ehsan is a PhD candidate in religious studies at Chapel Hill. Iris is an art history PhD candidate here at Duke. Allison is a doctoral student in Hebrew Bible at the Duke Div School. And they're going to present, and there's going to be a response. Thank you very much, Malachi, from Malachi Cohen, who's already introduced himself. Bass Fellow, Professor of History at Duke University, and also, most importantly, my PhD advisor. So go ahead, Ehsan, and take it away.
Thank you so much.
Ehsan, we can't hear you. Unmute yourself.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. All right, so let me begin with momentarily changing the title of the work group from Religion and Public Life to Religion and Public Space, or simply Religion and Space. The aim of this mischievous substitution is twofold. First, I wish to highlight that public life is not merely a spatial phenomenon, but in the era of nation states, a political one. Second, public space is not simply a counterpart to the private domain of individual life. The politics of public space constantly penetrates, if not invades, the private sphere of domesticity. Perhaps I can now do away with the concept public life altogether and work instead with three categories: a state, religion, and a space. In this triad, religion, unsurprisingly, should be simultaneously private and public, a privatized spirituality with no external manifestation, and a public pledge of allegiance to a state. The state concerns itself only with public representation of the religion minorities, but also with their consciousness. It seems to me, nonetheless, that by talking about religion and public life, we might let's slide the problem of private life and the ways in which the question of representation, that is, public images of individuals and communities, foreshadowed the question of class relations of production and distribution. But what is my project? Let me quickly share my screen and say a few words about this public space. Do you see my slide? The image? Yes, okay. All right. I have been studying the Elham Award for Architecture as a framework to think about categories of space, religion, and politics. The award recognizes projects that, in short, serve Muslim communities. This is already interesting because when you say serving, what does it mean and how do you serve communities? Oh, you only see the text, okay. Now what about that? All right, thank you. Now you see the slides. So one of the things that has happened is that the designers, instead of saying who was the problem, they presented this, all right, sorry about that. Now you see the slide, right? They represented this flag, this image, to say there are many communities and all these communities have the same share in the design. But actually, when you look at the map and you look at the ethnic makeup of the project, you will see that the problem were actually their Muslim community or immigrants. So they designed this park, and this is the sign that they created. They picked this sign from this public participation project that they invited a community to introduce signs from their culture. And one member brought this picture of a dentist sign in Doha, and they just built this. So the question is that, you know, what type of representations are at work and who is represented? Now, the point is that I think when in 2005, there was Danish cartoon controversy and the French cartoon controversy, the idea of crescent and moon was at the center of this. But when they translated it into architecture, everybody seemed to be happy with this. You know, the point is that instead of a star, a putatively religious Islamic sign, it is a tooth advertisement of that guy's business. When in September 2005, the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten published a cartoon of the Prophet with crescent, some Muslims perceived this as a blasphemous insult. Here, on the contrary, the democratization of the semiotic field and pluralization of value horizons permit promiscuous juxtapositions. Symbols that formerly were associated with the sacred are now reduced to profane signs. The otherwise blasphemous sign functions as a vaccine of sorts, a low dose of trigger that does not amount to violence. Now, I would like to make some points, and here I want to thank my colleagues at Kennan Institute for helping me to develop these ideas. The first point, I want to be clear that I'm ambivalent about this space. There are positive elements, inclusivity, diversity, pluralism. There are suspicious processes, these curatorial practices, patronizing colonial gaze, as it were, with selecting certain objects of these people, and then negative consequences, privatization of space and further gentrification of these community, of these architectural spaces. I ask if the hybrid sign, the crescent and tooth, is a bad compromise. This is a compromise, after all. Is it a bad compromise? What would have been said if the designers had used the crescent and star instead of this mixed simulacrum, the original sign, as it were? What it would have implied that Muslim minorities are accepted as they are without any change, would not have native Danes call an erected crescent and a star sitting tall at the middle of public space, an Islamic flag, and with that, the notion of Islamization of Europe or Islamic conquest. Second, The inclusiveness we observe here can be a form of a spatial tokenism, representation for the sake of representation, without addressing the social relations of domination. Talking about my ambivalence, we might see this compromise representation as something positive. Representation matters because the more the images and representation are inserted in the civil landscape, the more their presence is accepted as normal. The question is not, there's all minorities accepted as fellow citizens with equal rights, or they are left eternally strangers. The third idea that I wanted to say is my suspicion toward the notion of giving voice as the preferred mode of action for the state. Everyone seems to be content with being heard. Voices are translated into still images that freezes memories into essentialized identities. The park is the manifestation, I would say, of architectural identity politics. And finally, I thank Elsa for a comment that she made about this, about the force to convert, as it were. Immigrants are supposed to convert to liberalism, but we don't know what are those liberal values. And no matter what they do, because of racial differences, they would never be accepted. Finally, I will end with this. And I ask Iris for her observation that this is an interesting thing. This is a barren park. And when you think about it as a mode of surveillance and control and policing, it makes perfect sense that this space is like that. So with that, I would save my time for Professor Hakulhan's response and comments. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Jacil. That was absolutely wonderful. Our next presenter is Iris. Go ahead, Iris.
Thank you so much. Wait, I'll share my screen and hopefully you'll all see it. So do you see the entire image? I can't see you, so I'll look at it. Okay.
Looks
Great.
good. Looks good.
Good, so I'll start. So good afternoon. It was an honor and a pleasure to be a part of this fantastic group. And I thank you all for this phenomenal opportunity. So less than 40 miles separate the two contemporary women artists, Elham Rockne and Emily Jacil, the former from Tel Aviv and the latter from Ramallah. The Israeli-Palestinian border that divides them is repeatedly crossed by Jacil in her installation Where We Come From, created in 2004. Here you see the image on the right. The installation includes documentation of how Jacil fulfills the wishes of diasporic Palestinians who cannot enter Israel. Requests such as visiting family members, monuments, or even eating a favorite local dish. Craving to visit her native land, Iran, Rockne produced Yusef Abad in 2014. Here you see it on the left. Rockne cannot return to Iran after immigrating to Israel in 1989. She thus produced her multi-channel video installation that enabled her to return virtually to Tehran. She covertly collaborated with an Iranian acquaintance who videotaped places in Iran that she hungered to see again. Rooted in memories of a land that she can no longer enter, Rockne seeks to return to her childhood neighborhood, tread the familiar path from her elementary school to her grandmother's house, and watch a movie in the local cinema. The two artworks were created in different social political contexts and deploy contrasting operating strategies. Nevertheless, both convey a feeling of longing and a sense of missing, which are inseparable from the experience of diaspora. Jacil and Rockne represent a new generation of Middle Eastern artists, women who grew up in the region and emigrated to another country. This emerging group of artists also includes Mona Khatoum, Suzanne Hefuna, Diana El-Khadid, Shirin Ashat, Lala Essaidi, Bushra Al-Mutwakel, and Janan El-Ani. The artists' individual circumstances of migration vary greatly. Whereas the majority of Middle Eastern women artists chose to leave their birthplace to pursue academic and artistic training in the West, A few emigrated due to the social political turmoil in their native lands. Even if by choice, leaving a country always entails a risk of not being able to return, or perhaps coming back to a country that had been fundamentally changed. Several artists learned this lesson firsthand. For many, their longing can never be sated, as several have had to wait years to return home, and some will never be able to step foot on their beloved landscapes again. A 15-year-long civil war devastated Lebanon after Lebanese Palestinian Muna Khattoum moved to England to pursue an academic and artistic education. Despite her original intention to return to Lebanon, the Lebanese civil war forced Khattoum to remain in exile. Her artwork Globe from 2007 is a large-scale metal sculpture of a globe divested of all cartographic information other than latitude and longitude lines, crafted in iron. Globe results in an empty prison-like cell. The visual result of her abstraction of the globe is a dysfunctional map, incapable of indicating the location of any singular place. Nevertheless, the installation offers an original cartographic representations of Khattoum's own experience of diaspora and dislocation, her existence in which no place on the entire globe is home. Shirin Neshat left Iran during the era of Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. On her first visit 15 years later, and 11 years after Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic Revolution had changed the face of the country, Neshat was interrogated at the Iranian airport. Reacting to that experience, to her first visit to Iran in the aftermath of the revolution, she created the photograph series Unveiling in 1993. In this work, she explores her relationship to her changed homeland and to its new regime. Unveiling is comprised primarily of Neshat's self-portraits wearing various coverings. After developing the photographs, Neshat inscribed the stills with Iranian feminist poetry in Persian and calligraphy. Enduring separation and distance and transforming the desire into art is a skill that Middle Eastern women artists like Khattoum, Neshat, Jacil, and Rockne have long been forced to hone. The work created by these émigré women expresses their hardships due to forced or self-imposed exile. These artists reflect, reminisce, and meditate about their distance from the familiar terrains of their childhood, the disparities between their upbringing and their current selves, and their separation from their own families, memories, and homelands. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Iris. That was very wonderful. Alison, go ahead and take it from here.
Thank you. So I suppose most of you are probably familiar with the song called Rivers of Babylon. It was a song recorded in 1970 by the Jamaican band, the Melodians, which gained worldwide recognition thanks to a 1978 cover by the disco group Boney M. And I'm bringing this up as the introduction to my talk because the song's lyrics are drawn almost entirely from Psalm 137, a text that's central to my project here. The psalm is traditionally believed to have been written during the Israelites' exile in Babylon from 597 to 539 BCE, and it describes the Israelite exiles sitting by the rivers of Babylon, that is, by the Euphrates near today's Baghdad. The Israelites remember their homeland of Jerusalem and lament, how could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? This same riverside lament has been read, sung, and treasured by displaced and suffering communities for thousands of years. So in 2010, Boney M, the group that covered the Rastafarian song in the late 70s, performed at the Palestine International Music Festival in Ramallah, the de facto capital of Palestine. But despite the crowd's insistent chants of Babylon, Babylon, they left the chart topper off the set list. The Associated Press reported afterwards that the festival organizers had told the band not to play the song. Maisie Williams, the lead singer, told press that the song had been deemed inappropriate for the context. Most likely, the lyrics' references to Zion and the psalm's association with Jewish longing for the land of Israel were deemed too politically fraught, too close to Zionism to be performed at a Palestinian festival or in Ramallah. The irony of the situation is that Psalm 137 and much of the Hebrew Bible laments a community's exile from the very same stretch of land from which the Palestinian diaspora is now exiled. The Old Testament of the Christian Bible is about loving, leaving, and returning to the historic land of Palestine. These texts lamenting exile and anticipating return to the Holy Land were enormously significant for the Jewish diaspora, especially for the 2 millennia between the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE and the creation of the state of Israel. Since the 1948 Nakba, which rendered some 80% of the Arab population of Palestine refugees, either in or outside the land, Palestinian Muslims and Christians have been in exile from the same land, which the Hebrew Bible describes. So over the past several decades, Palestinian Christian theologians have drawn on Latin American and Black liberation theology to develop a new stream of thought known as Palestinian liberation theology. Naim Atik, Mumther Isaac, Mitri Rahed, Salim Munayer, and others grapple with the Old Testament's depiction of the people of Israel as a chosen people to whom God gives a promised land. The liberation theology movement explores how, despite a history of exclusivist readings, the Bible affirms the rights of Jews and Palestinians to coexist peacefully in the Holy Land. In some ways, texts like Psalm 137 seem like a natural focus for the Palestinian Christian diaspora. The ancient Israelites lamented their exile from the same land which Palestinian Christians have left, whether by force or by will. Yet I found little to no engagement with these texts in the work of Palestinian theologians. Instead, it's become apparent that dealing with lament texts like Psalm 137 brings up a whole new set of issues for Palestinian Christians. The text represents the experience of a group that ultimately spent some 2,000 years as a diaspora community. In 2023, Palestinians will mourn the 75th anniversary of the Nakba. Nobody wants to imagine another 1900 years of dispossession. Would embracing these texts like Psalm 137 that were written at the very beginning of a long exile, suggest resignation? Even if not, even if they were only to serve as a temporary source of inspiration, these texts are central to Jewish, even Israeli tradition. They have never had the same poignancy for Palestinians, especially Palestinian Christians. It's a community which traces itself to the same house churches formed in Jerusalem and along the Sea of Galilee by Jesus' first disciples. They've never been absent from the land in the same way. So how can that church possibly embrace texts which have been so central to the theology and politics which cast them out of their homes? So my question is, will Palestinians ever be able to sing Rivers of Babylon without raising a flurry of political and theological issues? Probably not on a certain level. None of us can really sing any song without subliminally evoking questions about meaning, ownership, and interpretation. That song will always be linked to Psalm 137. Psalm 137 will always be linked to the history of Jewish interpretation. On another level, though, generations build up their own traditions and cultures change. The song could become a symbol of Palestinian liberation one day. Either way, the example of this psalm demonstrates that reading the Bible, as with reading any text, is always about more than simple words on the page before us. Thank you for your attention.
Excellent presentation, Allison. I'm going to turn things over to Malachi at this point.
Yeah, so thank you, Ilza, and thank you for everyone who presented in that session on Islam and representations of belonging. These are three wonderful and original projects that speak to each other, and they are exemplary of the interdisciplinary conversation that the graduate shop seeks to cultivate, and it's rarely realized. So this one is a fulfilled dream. I would suggest actually a somewhat modified title. Only one paper is strictly on Muslim identity, and one is specifically on Palestinian Christian one. But all the papers are about home and exile in the diaspora, or more somberly, about elusive home, diaspora in exile, because it's the unfulfilled search for home that moves the agents of each paper. So Iris highlights immigrant Middle Eastern women, artists, Palestinian, Israeli, Lebanese, and Iranian, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian, imagining their homeland in the diaspora, their distance due to forced or self-imposed exile. She says these artists reflect reminiscence and mediate about their distance from the familiar terrains of their childhood, the disparities between their upbringing and their current selves, and their separation from their own families, memories, and homelands. I would distinguish clearly between diaspora, which should be viewed as normal rather than national life as normal and diaspora as abnormal. But I would distinguish between diaspora, which is normal, and exile, which is the separation from home. And the shared Middle Eastern experience among artists ignores the power difference here. So, but I would say that anyone who's critical of Iris and of our other interlocutors should be told that first, that Iris shows that the power difference splits national communities, and they are as capable of forcing distance and exile as the national differences are. And second, I would say that we have been focusing enough on power difference, and that a better future requires precisely the recognition of shared experiences, or at least experiential affinities. So, bravo. Ersan, Ersan, do I pronounce it correctly? Is it super killing or super kylen?
Super killing.
Super killing, yeah. Ersan super killing as the site of assimilation is about the elusive search for home in the diaspora among the Muslim communities in Denmark. It shows how borders can be drawn internally and exile created in a new home. He highlights the endeavor to create a park representing the different cultures and former homes for a Copenhagen ghetto, and shows the difficulty, if not the impossibility, of the task. How does one create a home? The ghetto is both a reflection of socioeconomic and cultural exclusion, and at the same time, an expression of minority solidarity, an endeavor to create a home. Ersan is skeptical, and I'm with him, about race as a marker here. And he represents opposition to religion as a marker too, because he thinks that it conceals the real reality of the grounds of domination. And the park, he concludes, reflects the negotiation of assimilation, of integration, of identity. That is what the park actually does. And Ersan is ambivalent about that because he thinks that the politics of identity clouds neoliberal economic domination and exclusion, the root of evil. But also Ersan seems to bracket then the question that he seems uncomfortable negotiating, and that is what is or what should be the dynamics of the negotiation of that type of identity. It is true, and I am with him, that it has socioeconomic grounding, but throwing our entire hope on socioeconomic exchange without the assumption about cultural negotiations may be also a mistaken move. And so I would want to know how Ersan proposes that we negotiate. Finally, Ellison on biblical exile and Palestinian liberation theology. And she asked, why was the river of Babylon not sung in Ramallah? And the answer is that historical association with Jewish exile and return made it impossible, given the realities of the Palestinian exile and the search for a return. And Ellison seeks to expand Jewish exile to universal one and to include in it Palestinian exile and return. So I would point out that the song, the way it is sung is not a complete Psalm 137. Parts of it would actually sustain Ellison's argument even more. The statement, if I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill, may my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, could be a testimony to the Palestinians not forgetting the right of return. But then the Psalm 137 ends with a call to vengeance. It has a very ugly ending. And this is probably not one that we would want to appropriate, even if it mirrors reality. Second, I would point out that Christian theological appropriation is in and of itself not historically unproblematic, because one reason this Psalm 137 was not widely used is that it speaks about the physical separation from Palestine or from the land of Israel, and it was translated into the spiritual exile and separation of the Christian believer, assuming a certain form of supersession, right, or a superiority of the spiritual to the physical one. But what Ellison would answer is that we are in a new reality right now. And in this new reality of Christian, Jewish, Muslims relations, Psalm 137 can be appropriated in ways that are universal in character and not one which creates an attempt of one religion to claim that it absorbs the other. But then I would also point out to the Muslim-Christian divide within the Palestinian community. The rivers of Babylon would not speak quite the same way to Palestinian Christians as it would to Palestinian Muslims. And here the Christian represents, in a way which is quite typical to the panel, the Christian Palestinians, a minority within a minority, an exile within an exile. But what emerges for me from the panel is a vision for a better Middle East and a home for Middle Eastern diaspora, which is grounded in the universality of exile and in the search for home and the resources for them within the biblical tradition, within art and literature. And I could not have hoped for more.
Thank you for that beautiful response, Malachi. We do have time, I think, for one question before we move on to the next panel. If somebody wants to type the letter Q into the chat, I will call on them. So first come, first serve. I'm not able to see all of you, so you will need to type in the chat if you'd like to ask a question.
The people may raise their hand also.
I would prefer that they not, because I can't see everybody.
Oh, you can't see them, okay.
Yeah, so I would strongly prefer if you could type keyword question or something like that in the chat if you would like to ask one quick question or offer one quick comment before we move on to the next panel. If nobody has any question, I would like to extend the opportunity to the panelists to respond to the response if they'd like to do that. Yeah, if Professor Radding would like to offer some quick comments now, we can do that.
Oh, thank you. It was really to the previous panel. That's why I didn't jump on your opportunity. This present panel was very moving, and I found each of these presentations very, very interesting. I guess going back to the first panel, what I wanted to say in terms of Perry's work, I signed a petition in favor of Eliseo Jimenez, and we were delighted to learn that his deportation was stopped. And in terms of Nerland's very interesting presentation, I do know from the history and lore of my own family that the fear of military conscription in the late Tsarist Empire was very, very real. In my case, on the part of Jewish families. And I wanted to ask Nerland if he works at all with the concept of ethnogenesis as he works through these changing identities from Kazakh to Chala Kazakh to Tatar. And to Elsa, to you, I would like very much to have the opportunity to meet with you. I'll just reduce my questions down to, in your interesting discussion about what you call conservative and liberal Christians or conservative and liberal Catholics, and I was wondering how you introduce the concept of natural law in the way that the Catholic theologians used it from the early 16th century forward. I also wonder how you work with the concept of mudehar in terms of Muslim conversion and the notion of people left behind, and its very important impact, and this does relate to the present panel, its important impact on art and architecture and the very conceptualization of space, and even of Spanish nationalism, which was an important part of the Cortes de Cádiz in 1810 to 1812. So I will just leave it there, and I think another set of questions would be around the problematic that Susan presented so brilliantly, I think, of this morphing of concepts of religious minority, the problem of the converso, into what Morisco may have become. And also, I think, I know you're not unaware of this, and what you presented was extremely, extremely short necessarily, but I think that the evolving meanings of Morisco and the problem of otherness in what was an empire, not a nation state, was not a question of citizenship, it was a question of subjecthood in the Mediterranean world, are best understood bringing in the development of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, and also the Americas are more richly understood when we compare them with the continuing Spanish preoccupation with and evolving presence in the Mediterranean. And of course, I know you know that Moriscos may have gone to North Africa, but they also went to Spanish America.
Yeah.
And they've been found in very interesting ways in the archives there.
I'm sorry that I will have to cut you off here, but we are going to have to return to the panels. We can have a short conversation about this at 2:30 when the panels end, but I would like to take it up with you over email later as well. So thank you very much for that very thoughtful and insightful comment. Let's have a quick round of applause for Allison, Ethan, Iris, Malachi. Okay. Moving on to the next panel, we have Migrant Outreach in Contemporary American Protestantism. Andrew Carlins, Master of Management Studies at Fuqua. Joseph Rozo, Sociology PhD candidate at Duke. Darwin Perry, third-year grad student at Duke Div School, with a response from Dr. Bruce Lawrence, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Religion here at Duke University. Joseph, I'm going to let you take it away from here.
All right. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can y'all see this? All right, great. So I realized that my project title on the program was about evangelicals on the issue of immigration in the era of Trump. And perhaps a more accurate title would be Evangelical Leaders on Immigration in the Age of Trump. And as we'll see, that's an important distinction. So as we all know, the election of Trump in 2016 was in some ways a shock to the system for some of us. And it elevated issues of Christian nationalism, particularly white Christian nationalism, in the political sphere. And there's been a lot of research on the role white Christian nationalism played in motivating support for Trump, particularly among evangelicals. And so much was made of the fact that, you know, a serial fornicator who could barely quote 2 Corinthians was the darling of the evangelical community, receiving massive swaths of support. And this came at the same time as Trump was elevating the issue of immigration to the forefront with a particular nationalistic bent. And so a question is, as white evangelicals were rallying around Trump, did this represent a shift in their support? Did this represent a change towards more nationalistic views on immigration? And is immigration, can it be rightfully thought of as a moral issue when it comes to religious groups on which religious leaders can take a moral stand on one way or the other? Now, at first blush, it might seem that, of course, this is an issue that will motivate change among evangelicals. This is a piece of artwork, using the term artwork liberally here, from a prominent evangelical artist. And this kind of brings together the themes that I've been discussing here. He portrays Trump as silently praying, a bunch of Democrats stomping on the flag, and ignoring the scary immigrant caravan or whatever coming over the border. And there is one thing I want to point out here is notice that Trump is praying over a little doll of an infant. And this is foreshadowing for what issue actually emerges as important for evangelicals in the era of Trump. So I'm just going to stick that little nugget there. Now, so to answer this question, I wanted to look to see how evangelical discourse changed over the Trump period. And so to limit my focus in a scope that was doable over the period of this last year, I focused on a particular website that's prominent in the evangelical sphere that deals with contemporary political issues from an evangelical perspective. And it's the Gospel Coalition, which was founded by some prominent evangelical pastors, and there are big name evangelical leaders on the leadership board. And these names, if you're familiar with leadership in the Southern Baptist Convention evangelical communities, these names will be big names to you. And so this is broadly representative of what I would term sort of the mainstream white evangelical leaders. And so through the use of a web scraper, I scraped all of the articles from this website from its inception until December 20th, 2020, and broke them up into periods before Trump announced his candidacy, during his campaign, and following his electoral victory in 2016. And so in total, there were 8,000 articles, and about 300 of them contained some reference to immigration, and about 400 of them contained some reference to abortion. And I'm going to spare you the gory details, but I broke down these articles into individual words and applied what's called a stimming algorithm. And what this does is it basically takes common endings of words and puts them together into the same root. So immigrating, immigration, immigrants, all of these words get combined to one root and treated the same. And so I wanted to see if discourse around the issue of immigration increased over time as Trump was campaigning and became president, and in the national discourse elevated the issue of immigration. And it turns out the answer is not really. So there is a spike in discussions around refugees during the Trump campaign, but that receded during his administration. And the discussion, the use of the terms around immigration saw no change, even possibly a bit of a dip during the Trump campaign. And this comes despite the fact that Trump is discussing immigration all the time, and it's elevated to a high degree in the public sphere. And to dig into the particular words that are used, so these are the words that are used across all articles. And as you can see, a lot of these words are the types of words you would expect from an evangelical religious corpus. So God, church, Christian, people, Jesus, so on. But comparing this to the words used in immigration articles, you see a lot of the same words. There are only a couple of references to immigration or refugees, and a lot of the discourse is really similar to the overall discourse, which implies that even the articles that are discussing immigration are not focusing on immigration, but in fact look a lot like the general articles and are maybe only referencing immigration on the side, not making immigration the focal point of the article. Now, returning to this chart, we notice a spike in refugee discussions around refugees, and that seems really huge until we look at discussions on abortion. And discussion on abortion completely dwarfs discussion on immigration. And in fact, it increased more during the Trump era than any of the words referring to immigration. And when we dig into the details of these abortion articles, notice how the words that are at the top of these articles, it's abortion. Abortion during the Trump campaign and during the Trump administration was the #1 word used in articles that contain the word abortion, which was not the case for immigration. And even some of the other words here, life, human, these are the kinds of words that are used in pro-life discourse, talking about the value of human life after conception. And so at the end, we're left with a couple of questions to ponder, which is, what is the role, what is the function of this focus on abortion doing in evangelical spheres? Even in a national context where the issue of immigration is ascendant, it was not having the same sway or the same dominance in the discourse among evangelical leaders. Instead, abortion was taking a primary role. And also, for people who are consuming this information, for people in this ecosystem, the question is, which issue is easier to compromise on? Which issue is easier to have debate on, or to say, I am supporting a candidate who maybe I disagree with on this issue, but I agree with them on other issues? Is it abortion or immigration? When abortion is so prominent and so clear and unilaterally condemnatory toward the practice, even if someone has more liberal views on immigration, can they really voice support for a candidate who is even not totally against abortion? And so these are some questions that I think are worth pondering going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation, Joseph. We're going to move on to Darwin.
Hey, how are you? Thank you to Professor Malachi, Julie, Elsa, all my peers. Yeah, my project examines the experiences of immigrant families with loved ones incarcerated and the role of the American Christian Church. Now, it's no secret that America incarcerates and incapacitates more individuals per capita than anywhere in the world. And this usage of mass imprisonment has effectively put into place what many scholars term as racial and ethnic caste systems, one that has primarily relegated Black and brown individuals into inferior positions via laws and customs. Now, while we cannot pinpoint the exact date wherein mass incarceration became an American institution that primarily responds to crime and wrongdoing, it can be approximated that in the 1970s, the rise in the usage of mass imprisonment resulted not due to a national change in behavior, but also due to a change in the application of punitive policies, of which disproportionately impacted Black and Brown families, particularly African American and Latino families in communities. Now, mass incarceration has effectively and increasingly become constitutive of the social experiences of many minoritized individuals. For many families with the loved one incarcerated, mass incarceration represents a new form of instability. Over 90% of all individuals in prison will one day be released, many of whom will attempt to reconnect with spouses, former partners, children, and now there are various consequences to family incarceration, but one of the most significant familial impacts is parental incarceration, which affects father's parenting, mother's parenting, relationship between parents, but most significantly, it compromises a child's well-being. In describing the impact of incarceration on families, I use the term symbiotic harms, and coined by Rachel Condry and Shona Minson. And symbiotic harms points to the harms of imprisonment specifically on a family domain. Now, what I found is that the effect of incarceration on immigrant families, native born or non-native born, does not differ drastically from that of non-immigrant families. So immigrant families and non-immigrant families, the effects does not differ drastically. Research suggests that immigrant families with a loved one or kin incarcerated experience a double punishment resulting from the symbiotic harms of incarceration, but also many immigrants experience disintegration, which refers to the formal and informal categorization and exclusion of immigrants to America. An example of this is the 1996 Immigration Reform and Control Act, which increased Border Patrol funding, contributed to the militarization of the Mexico border, increased funding for the construction of the detention centers, and prohibited employment of many undocumented or overstayers. Now, the rise of disintegration, the exclusion of many immigrants in America, has paralleled the rise of mass incarceration. And after examining the impact of how incarceration impacts immigrant families, I turned to the Christian church to function not only as a religious institution, but in general, a Protestant or Catholic social institution that engages the everyday lives and experiences of everyday people. And I draw specifically on two models of engagement. From James Logan, is one, and the second model that I'm drawing on for the purpose of this project is from Timothy Gorinch. They each proffer practical mediums to engage families with incarcerated loved ones. Logan's framework is called Healing Memories, James Logan's framework, and Timothy Gorinch is labeled as conflict resolution and mediation initiatives, which each provides a structural and practical opportunity for reconciliation, resolution, and restoration without the added consequences of further engagement with America's criminal justice system. Now, drawn on these models of engagement, I situate the church rather than the offender at the center of how we should engage families with an incarcerated loved one. But moreover, this situates the Christian church as an institution, a social institution that identifies issues and challenges socially, makes senses of those societal issues and challenges, and formulate strategies practical to address them. And that's the role of the Christian church. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darwin, for that very delightful presentation. We're going to move on very quickly to Andrew.
Thanks, Elsa, and thank you to Professor Cohen and this fellowship for what's been a very enriching experience. I created a quick PowerPoint presentation that I'd like to share regarding my the research project. My research focused on refugee economic empowerment through connecting nonprofits and religious institutions. A little bit, moving on quickly, I wanted to give you background to motivation of my research. It comes from, for the past 4 years, I've been part of the citizenship lab at Duke University, which is a really great community. It involves, it helps connect local refugees who have been resettled in Durham across different age groups to Durham, to Duke students to help advocate and empower refugee communities. I've developed a particularly close relationship with a resettled refugee from Rwanda named Faustin. We call each other brothers, and someone very special in my life. And I learned a lot from him about the refugee experience, about his experiences integrating and assimilating to American culture. And what was particularly noteworthy to me about Faustin's experience was how central of a role his Seventh-day Adventist community played in his life, and a very central social network. A lot of his deep mentors and friends in the United States have come from that. And with working with other young adult refugees through the citizenship lab, I found that, I found very similar stories with people from the Seventh-day Adventist community, people from the Muslim community, people from across different religious groups. A pretty constant theme was that the religious institutions play a role beyond just a place where you go for religion, but also a strong social network, especially among refugees resettled in Durham. Another thing that I've noticed, and that Faustin was explaining, is that the access to economic opportunities, the knowledge of different opportunities that exist on a relative scale is limited. Simply because access to language language acquisition, cultural acquisition, this all takes time, and this dichotomy didn't sit well with me, and it led to my question of could religious institutions, which have the unique ability to bring together people from diverse economic backgrounds, people from diverse racial backgrounds, from diverse nationality backgrounds, all bound together by a similar set of core beliefs, could these institutions be used to help share social capital and increase access to economic opportunities for refugees and newcomers in general, specifically in Durham? The idea of this case study, though, would be that the same methodologies could be expanded to other parts of the United States as well. This visual shows that I want to emphasize that there are different kinds of course, forms of social capital, but my research tries to connect the religious institutions and communities with economic empowerment nonprofits. The journey of my research was pretty hampered by COVID. It was unfortunate. At the beginning, I was quite optimistic, but with COVID's continued impact on the accessibility of really general society, it ended up that the research had to focus on interviewing nonprofit leaders. I had wanted to interview directly local young adult refugees. It became increasingly difficult because of access to technology and language. So I tailored the research to talk to local nonprofit leaders to see if, in their opinion, it would be realistic, or if anything had been tried in the past to connect economic empowerment, their economic empowerment mission, with religious communities for migrants and refugees in Durham. The implications of this would be, of course, to expand the role of religious institutions, dovetailing off of what Darwin was saying, to expand religious institutions into the economic realm as well, to allow for the exchange of social capital and increase economic opportunities for refugees and migrants who are members of different congregations. I could go into detail if anyone has questions, or I'll post my email looking at the time about the questions and the structure of the interviews. But in the end, three different economic empowerment nonprofits in Durham were interviewed: Step Up Durham, DCI, or Durham Children's Initiatives, and the Helios Foundation. And what I found from these interviews is that the hypothesis that religious institutions can and maybe should expand their role into helping their congregants, specifically their newcomer congregants, access economic or local economic opportunities, that hypothesis should probably be revised or even rejected. And that's because many of the nonprofits who did partner with religious institutions found that attendance just wasn't significant at, for example, resume building event or resume workshops or interview workshops. Also because a lot of the economic empowerment nonprofits, albeit they don't have a explicit religious affiliation, many of them will identify as, for example, a faith-informed nonprofit, and will therefore have undertones geared towards a certain set of religious groups, which would prevent specifically religious minority newcomers from accessing their services or fully being immersed. And finally, I identified that that because of this undertone, there's a shortfall of resources in Durham for religious minority newcomers to access economic opportunities through faith-based initiatives and institutions. I could go into more detail if people have questions about some of the core quotes and the findings of the interviews, but the final recommendation is that more attention should be given into developing resources dedicated to refugees of religious minorities, including better outreach about economic opportunities and the combination of socio and religious integration in the Durham community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was very thoughtful and thorough. I'm going to turn things over to Professor Lawrence.
Am I unmuted now? Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, we got you, Bruce. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Malachi, for organizing this and directing this very interesting project under Keenan. And thanks to Julie for all the technical wizardry that she produced to make this possible. And thank all of you who have been part of this project and have presented today, and also those who are going to present in the final panel. So one of the strange things is that I'm responding to a panel where I have the least expertise. I probably could have done all right in the first one because I've traveled a lot through the Muslim world and lived in a variety of Muslim countries at different periods of time. And also the second panel because it was so much engaged with either the Near East, Middle East, but also things that relate to Islam. So now, as it turned out, I'm on a third panel where Islam doesn't get mentioned at all. And that's not to say that there's anything deficient about the presenters. In fact, each of their categories is very interesting. But when one thinks of the whole sweep of these four panels, it's very interesting that this one, if I can use the term for it, is the most localized. That is to say, it represents and projects and engages issues that are specifically North American, US. And I would even say I was trying to, when I was thinking about my remarks, trying to do a timeline. And of course, Joseph helps a lot because he just point blank says, I'm going to talk about the Trump era. And so we don't have any doubt about where his resources are. But Darwin seems to be generally talking about things in the 21st century and more specifically things that have happened in the last decade. And I'm not really sure at the end, when I got through James, what his timeline was, Andrew rather, I felt that Andrew was talking generally about the procedure and a structure, and all three of the papers had very interesting points. But in the last one, I felt really the pinch of the pandemic, if I can use that phrase, more than some of the others, because I really did long to hear the voices of those people whom you could not interview, Andrew, because I would like to think that it would have been a different and maybe slightly brighter prospect. So let me say that I came out of all three of these with something which might be called a dystopic view of what religion and immigration can do in an American context in the Trump and now the post-Trump era. So if I can start with the end with Andrew, whose project was limited and had to be redirected because of COVID, he's really talking about the issue of citizenship and how it comes out of the citizenship lab project on which he's been engaged so intensely for the last few years. And yet at the end of it, one really feels that the religious institutions are not as geared up to help immigrants as are the nonprofit units that he was able to interview. And again, I don't know whether this would be the outcome if we had not had COVID and he had been able to interview the other two groups that he was not able to interview. But one gets the sense of the sweep of what he talked about. Again, it wasn't a paper, it was just I saw what you saw, a slide presentation. But what I derived from that, from Andrew's presentation, was that, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I got as the final result of it, that nonprofit organizations, even those, or especially those with a religious orientation, are better suited to deal with the relocation and economic prospects for immigrants than are religion only or religious specific institutions. So in one sense, that's not a very hopeful prospect, in that it seems to suggest that the churches are not going to be very active for immigrants. But even that limited window is better, or at least more hopeful, than what Joseph produces in a sweeping sociological analysis that reminded me of the best of quantitative analysis that one can produce with a sociological frame of reference, in which we really saw how language does reflect people's deep attitudes and their actions. And at the end of it, as someone said, could you summarize it one line? And I would say, abortion always trumps immigration in the mind of evangelicals. And then I'd have to say, oh, wait a minute, maybe just evangelical leaders and not evangelical constituents. But my suspicion, and Joseph could certainly correct me if I'm wrong about that, is that what he was saying from all the range of this literature and the surveys that he brought into his very rich analysis, the end result of it is that abortion, because it's a singular issue and because actually there's this vivid picture of Trump in a rare prayerful mode looking at this infant in the ground, or image of an infant in the ground with all the hordes behind him, that in that one picture, which to me stands out more than all the other slides in his presentation, there's a sense in which Trump is representing abortion as more important than immigration, and that mirrors his constituents, or at least the constituents that he did have among evangelicals. So I have a deep issue there about whether this is going to be a lingering, persistent thing beyond the Trump era, or if the Trump era is going to persist beyond the Trump presidency. So that would be a question I have to Joseph, which I hope he could answer. And for Andrew, of course, the question would be, what will happen after COVID? Is he going to be able to talk to some of the other groups, which he would need to give a richer analysis of religious institutions as distinct from the nonprofits that he interviewed? And I've saved Darwin to the last because in one sense, Darwin's paper is part of the other three, but it's an outlier to the other three, because Darwin does something which to me is fascinating. First of all, in terms of church support of immigrants experiencing incarceration, the suggestion seems to be that they are really still grappling with how to define what is a distinction between those who were incarcerated in the long history of mass incarceration in America and those new prospects for incarceration, which come from the immigrant, but also the refugee community. And one of the things I would urge Darwin to do, and I think Joseph and Andrew would find this also in me, is to at every point distinguish a little more clearly than was done here between immigrants and refugees, because immigrants have a certain status. At least they have the possibility of citizenship. Refugees are more at the mercy of institutions of access and domestication, and often just outright refusal. So I think a careful distinction there would be helpful. But I think also to sharpen up the timeline, Darwin, in your excellent presentation, you mentioned these two literary sources, which have helped you think about the notion of memories and healing memories and how they help incarcerated, but then the institutional work of how you actually relate to people who have experienced incarceration, and especially if they happen to be parents, and so that the damage is not just to themselves but to their families as a result of their incarceration. So I think in all three papers there are windows of research and indices of imagination that I had not perceived before reading them, and I found very helpful. And the thing I would ask in terms of the richness of the overall project, which is the intersection of religion and immigration, is that there be a more careful attention to timeline, and also I might say to use of images. The fact that I can remember from, even though Joseph has a spectacular sociological analysis, that one picture of Trump standing next to the child, or the image of a child in the grass and the masses behind him, is probably a more vivid recollection than I have of anything else that he presented. And I would think that the semiotics, I'm aware of the fact that we're having this conference the day after Facebook announced that Trump would no longer be able to have access for another 6 months, but they would review it in 6 months to see if they're correct or not. That the whole notion of social media, which indirectly is part of Joseph's paper, does not come up in either Andrew's or Darwin's, are really important elements in how you think about migrant outreach in contemporary American Protestantism. So I would applaud all three of these papers and the persons who pursued them and some of the early findings they have, and just ask that in terms of terminological precision, especially about refugees and immigrants, and about use of media, and especially the role of the internet and social media in the topics that they explore, they might include these in future iterations of their papers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very sedulous and attentive response, Professor Lawrence. We do have 3 minutes left in the session, but I'm just going to go ahead and move on to the next one, just to give us a little bit of a cushion of time. So let's just have a round of applause for Joseph, Darwin, Andrew, and Bruce. The next panel is called Theologies of Migration and Home. And the first presenter will be Joshua Strayhorn, history PhD student at Duke, Alberto La Rosa Rojas, PhD candidate at Duke, and the third presenter will be Eric Hong, who is a student in world Christianity at Duke. There will be response from Professor Matthew Kressler, who teaches religious studies at the College of Charleston. Joshua, I'm going to let you take it from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to share screen really fast. Can everyone see it? Let me full screen. Okay. Thank you, Professor Cohen, Elsa, Dr. Kressler, and Julie as well for organizing all of this. So yeah, I'm going to present. I've been working on my perspectives actually to move on to PhD candidacy, and I was working through some of the questions here in the group, and I enjoyed so much of the time working with everyone. And I'm going to move quickly because I don't want to go over time. So my project is called Knowledges of Mobility, Black Migration and Religion in North Carolina, 1877 to 1900. I'm going to read a quick quote. So in the spring of 1879, thousands of colored people unable longer to endure the intolerable hardships, injustice, and suffering inflicted upon them by a class of Democrats in the South had in utter despair fled panic-stricken from their homes and sought protection among strangers in a foreign land. And this is a quote from a report from the Select Committee on the Removal of Negroes from the Southern states to Northern states that was written in 1880. And that kind of forms the basis of my project. I am looking at what were the causes and roots of migration from the South in the post-Reconstruction period. I know a lot of people know about the Great Migration, the movement of millions of African Americans from the South and northern cities in the 20th century, but not as many people are familiar or have studied the 19th century migration, which contained fewer numbers, but which I argue is just as significant in many ways. So I pull a lot from Nell Painter, famous historians, work exodusters as well, and specifically looking at North Carolina as an interesting space, mostly because I'm from North Carolina, and also because North Carolina has a particular interesting history in relationship to African Americans in the aftermath of slavery. So I'm going to skip to my research questions. So my questions in thinking about this were, what were developing information networks in the post-war era How did local, state, national, and international politics shape Black migration? How did Black people's understandings of geopolitics shape their conceptions of Blackness, their responsibility to the race, and their commitment to forging a better life for both their individual families and the race? And lastly, and what I worked on most explicitly in this project was how does religion influence migration possibilities? So I'll conclude with looking at my intervention. So I was trying to formulate sort of an analytic for understanding how rural Black farmers and sharecroppers in the late 19th century thought about their opportunities for migration in this world, in this landscape. So I came up with geopolitical knowledges. So I'm very interested in how information traveled throughout Black communities, how word of mouth, Black newspapers that were developed during the period, as well as social settings like churches and other venues where the future of the race was discussed. And particularly for religion, I'm interested in Charles Long's concept of orientation, in which he argues that basically to understand Black religion, you have to understand how Black people were relating to their social and spatial relationship to both the earth and to white people and to the state all simultaneously. And so I'm using that understanding of religion to understand how they weighed the options of whether staying on the land where they didn't own or moving to places like Nebraska and Indiana, and what were the concepts that made up, what were the factors that contribute to this, like land loss, like spirituality, like ideas about exodus. So yeah, that's my project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacil. That was incredibly thorough and thoughtful. So thank you very much for that. We're going to move on to Alberto's presentation at this point.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Joshua, and thank you, Malachi and Elsa and Matthew for your response and for setting this conference up. My name again is Alberto La Rosa Rojas. I'm a theologian at Duke Divinity School, and my research is on the meaning and importance of home for a flourishing life. My research is fueled by my own experience as an immigrant from Peru. So in my own life, it has been difficult for me to experience a true, enriching and abiding sense of home. And by home, I mean a whole host of things, of belonging, intimacy, connection, rootedness. And I've had that difficulty not only here in the United States, where I grew up as an immigrant for a period of time, undocumented, but also once I gained my United States citizenship and returned to Peru, I felt similar experience of not belonging, of not being at home. And I know that my experiences are not singular. Many immigrants experience these very same things. Yet it seems to me that a sense of home is crucial for a flourishing life. Indeed, it seems that many of the struggles that we see today, struggles to regain, establish, and uphold a sense of home in the world, are the critical struggles in our contemporary societies, whether they're related to mass migration, whether they're related to ecological devastation or what it means to share a common home in this world, or rising movements in nationalism. And it is not only immigrants who struggle with cultivating a sense of home in the world. Many who identify as natives or citizens, particularly in wealthier Western nations, are also struggling with maintaining a sense of home in this changing world. And often it is immigration or migrants who are identified as those who threaten the stability, the continuity of home for natives and citizens. Therefore, a key tension that lies at the heart of our contemporary immigration crisis has to do with the migrants longing for home on the one hand, and on the other hand, the citizen or the native's fear-laden desire to protect and preserve their home from the perceived threat of migrants. Now, this tension between migrants and citizens or natives is by no means recent or unique to our time. In 1630, for example, when arriving on the shores of the Americas, Captain John Winthrop urged the other colonial settlers with him to build a city upon a hill in this new world, in what would be the United States. Now, Captain Winthrop's vision drew life from the words of Jesus's Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus urges his disciples to be a beacon of light and goodness to the nations. However, those Christians who colonized and who migrated to the New World built their cities and their new homes through the displacement of native peoples and the destructions of native cultures. So their longing for a new home precipitated a tragic collapse of native homes. Now, while migrants who are now arriving on American shores, are much more vulnerable than their 17th century predecessors, and in fact, often the migrants who are now coming to the United States are first forced to leave their homes precisely because of the aftermath of colonialism and colonization and that legacy. Nevertheless, I think we can see how a crisis of home, of who can claim home and what it means to be at home in the world, lies at the very foundations of the Americas, even as it has continued to unfold with each new generation of land-hungry and home-hungry migrant and migrant-resisting native. Now, considering this history, my research asks how Christianity can provide an alternative vision, one of many peoples sharing a common flourishing home in the world that undoes this historical binary between the migrant and the native citizen. I argue that such a Christian vision of home must emerge from reflecting on the creative everyday struggles of those on the margins to cultivate a sense of home on the world. And when I say those on the margins, I mean the migrant, the displaced, the homeless. After all, the figure at the center of Christian devotion, Jesus Christ, was himself a displaced person according to the Bible, and often occupied marginal spaces. Just to give a few examples, according to the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus was an infant, his family had to leave their home to seek refuge in a foreign land in Egypt. That comes from Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 23. One might say that the longing for home is sacred, and that the Bible places a special focus on the struggles of those who inhabit the margins, of those who have lost home, the homeless and the displaced. So what ought we do? The reality is that for good or for ill, how each of us thinks about and practices homemaking, regardless of our religious or non-religious affiliation, has serious implications for our flourishing life together. As environmental scientists, sociologists, and biologists increasingly tell us, humans are stitched together in networks of interdependency, not only with other members of our human community, but even with our broader ecological community. Therefore, I think we all need to reflect more deeply on what practices can cultivate open households, which recognize the interdependence we share with our neighbors, be they our ecological neighbors, our human neighbors, our neighbors across cities, states, and even nations. And paradoxically, those who are not afforded the modern model of home or homemaking, a model that is based on privacy, on soundproof, on being fenced off and isolated. So those who inhabit the margins of society, they might just be the best able to tell us how to imagine a new way of sharing a common home in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alberto. That was riveting. Our final presentation in this entire conference actually is going to be Eric. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for hosting this conference. It is my privilege to participate today. I'm Xianfeng Hong. You may also call me Eric. I'm from Hong Kong. I'm a second-year PhD student in religion, world Christianity at Duke. So my paper is titled From Singing Out of Tone to Producing Contextualized Cantonese Hymns, Hong Kong in the Decentralization of Chinese Christianity. So Hong Kong Christians often find themselves singing out of tone. They are not out of tune, but out of tone. While most of them speak Cantonese, a tonal language that has 9 tones, many Chinese hymns were written to be sung in Mandarin, which has only 4 tones. And when these hymns are sung in Cantonese, the tones of most of the words would be distorted. And this would sometimes create unwanted meanings. For example, when the word Lord, 主, which is sound and pronounced in the second tone, is pronounced in the first tone to fit the music. Lord Jesus, 主耶稣, will be sung and heard as Pig Jesus, 主耶稣. So hymns are important theological resources to be studied when assessing the development and contextualization of Christianity in a certain place or among a certain group of people. And this paper traces the development and the use of hymns used by Christians in Hong Kong. It finds out that Cantonese-speaking Christians in Hong Kong have sung Chinese hymns written for Mandarin singing in an out-of-tone manner for over a century. And it was until the late 1970s that contextualized Cantonese hymns were produced and sung. It argues that locally this change was facilitated by the rise of Canton pop in the mid-70s and political changes in the 1980s, including the discussion of the future of Hong Kong, the Tiananmen Square massacre, and events in the 2010s, including the 2014 Umbrella Movement and the 2019 anti-extradition law protests, which both strengthen the Hong Kong identity. It also argues that global forces, including the praise and worship movement, which originated in the US, and the production of gospel folks in Taiwan, played important parts in stimulating the production of contextualized Cantonese hymns. Furthermore, this change not only constitutes a contextualization of Christianity in Hong Kong, putting it in the perspective of global Chinese Christianity, such a change also constitutes the decentralization of mainland China as the heart of Chinese Christianity and the rise of new nuclei and hubs of Christian resources. So this study is significant in several ways. First, it contributes to the study of Chinese Christian music. Very little study has been done to the study of language or dialect-specific study within the study of Chinese hymnology. And second, it contributes to the regional studies in Chinese Christianity, in particular in the study of history of Christianity in Hong Kong. And third, this research also contributes to the study of the globalization of Chinese Christianity, especially on how new nodes of influences established by Chinese migrants influence each other. So in whose religion is Christianity, the gospel beyond the West, Lamin Sane states that indigenizing the faith means decolonizing its theology. While the creation of Chinese hymns helped to decolonize the Christian faith that was brought to China by Western missions, standardization through the creation of Mandarin-centric national hymnals again ignored the local language and cultural differences within the invented nation and established new dominating authorities. The creation of Cantonese hymns in Hong Kong since the 1970s break such domination, and in the process, a new imagined community that embraces a new collective identity, the Hong Kongers, re-theologized with new local experience, including the latest experience of oppression, resistance, and powerlessness. So the creation and singing of these Cantonese hymns by Hong Kongers and those who identify with this identity, including overseas Hong Kongers, in turn forge and reinforce this collective identity and community. And such creation and singing of Cantonese hymns therefore contribute to the decentralization of Chinese Christianity from a Mandarin and mainland-centric one to one that articulates a more diverse experience by Chinese Christians around the world. In light of the growing intervention by and direct application of communist state power in Hong Kong, any form of contextualization of Christianity in Hong Kong that stresses bottom-up local experience is likely to be considered as a challenge to state authority. So it is my prayer that Hong Kong Christians can continue to produce and conduct contextualized worships that reflect decolonizing theologies in the upcoming difficult years. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was excellent and highly nuanced. I'm going to turn the table over at this point to Professor Kressler.
Hey, y'all. It's good to be with you from the Carolina to the south of the gathering. Thank you, Malachi and Julie, and really everyone here and involved in this project for the work that you've done and for inviting me into this space with you. Most especially Joshua, Alberto, and Eric, your work. You agreed to comment on papers in a conference, and my first impulse is, well, what am I possibly going to have to say? Often engaging work that kind of goes beyond my area of expertise. And then you read and listen to the work that you're producing, and I'm like, oh my God, how am I going to possibly just limit what I'm going to say to like 5 to 10 minutes? I mean, I'm just hearing some of these presentations right now, like the way that y'all have condensed a year's worth of work into like two to 5 minutes is like kind of mind-boggling. So thank you for inviting me here. And I'm going to begin with some general thoughts that I think are applicable to all three presenters. And then I'm going to actually move in inverse order. So from Eric to Alberto to Joshua, which happens to coincidentally move from most outside of my area of expertise to most in my area of expertise. So this final panel, Theologies of Migration and Home, is pitched kind of generally as one that focuses on the religious experiences of immigrants and how those religious experiences are primary to understanding migration, immigration, immigrant communities. But I actually want to, by putting these three papers, when we put these three papers together, I actually want to push this a little bit further and argue that all three of you aren't simply unpacking the ways that religious experiences of immigrant communities are fundamental to understanding immigration, but I would contend that you're also even more so reinforcing the fact that religion itself is a migratory phenomenon, meaning that religion itself is a phenomenon that transcends borders and boundaries, often over and against the desires of many of the practitioners in those very communities. So practitioners of particular religious traditions are often in the business of attempting to maintain and reinforce the boundaries of their own national communities or even of their own religious communities. And I think that each of your projects kind of highlights the ways in which religion as it is lived doesn't, kind of mitigates against that impulse. I guess what I'm suggesting is I think all three of your projects, have the potential to shift the conversation from religions and migration to religion as migration or religion as migratory in and of itself. I think that together you also raise questions. So Alberto, in your presentation, you raised this question about the moral validity of national boundaries, and to kind of use that metaphor, or to kind of play with that metaphor a bit, I think that your three presentations also raise questions for me about the nature, the stability, and validity of religious boundaries, right? That it's not just kind of national boundaries that are at stake in these stories that each of you are telling, but also religious boundaries, whether those are the boundaries between what we might think of as discrete traditions, or to take Eric's example, right, the kind of the boundaries that we assume operate within a tradition itself, within global Christianity. So lots of thoughts, lots of questions. To move to each of the three presenters, and to begin with Eric, the point that really riveted me about your paper was that last point where you talk about how, in the context of this conversation about decolonizing Christianity, how the creation of Chinese hymns that in one sense helped to decolonize the Christian faith
you know, at the same time reinforced a kind of Mandarin-centric sense of what kind of quote unquote Chinese Christianity was. And so I really applaud your paper for challenging, I think, our impulse to overly simplistic, singular, and unidirectional assumptions about the movement and making of religion. You know, so in other words, like we think of this as a movement from the so-called West to the non-West, so-called, or to the global South, as has become popular to talk about. But you're really you kind of challenge that unidirectional singularity, right? To say that there isn't one, you know, either linguistically or culturally speaking, there isn't one kind of Chinese Christianity that inevitably or that inherently decolonizes this tradition. So a question I was wondering as I was listening to your presentation was, how does language itself shape the ways that religion is lived in community and in human bodies? And this is a kind of provocative question to ask that I think resonates with all three presentations, but struck me with yours. To what extent can we think about these linguistic and cultural transformations as the production of distinct traditions, or the creation of new traditions? You know, in this question of whose religion is Christianity, you know, I wonder, are we talking about a singular tradition, Christianity? Or are we talking about the kind of production of Christianity's plural? This is something I think a lot about with African-American Christianity, which is like my own area of expertise, right? Like, to what extent does it make sense, or is it helpful or useful to talk about Black Christianity in the US as the same tradition as the tradition of kind of white nationalist Christians, right? To use a very dramatic kind of contrast. So to what extent do these linguistic and cultural transformations, is it helpful to talk about, or to think about these as the creation of distinct traditions? And this is totally random, Eric, but whenever we get into the question of language and religion and Christianity, I think of one of the best novels I've read in a long time, Michael Faber's The Book of Strange New Things, which is a science fiction novel about an evangelical missionary to another planet. And the question at the heart of that novel is, to what extent is what is important about the Bible the words themselves? And to what extent is it the meaning that must be then translated to another culture? So anyway, that's just a fun, if you're looking for a fun outlet to think through these questions. Thank you for your paper. For Alberto, I was, again, really riveted by the ought of your paper, the kind of moral imperatives that emerged from your presentation. And so you were getting me to ask really big questions that I really appreciated. So, you know, where is home? What constitutes home? And I think a theme that you raised, which I think is spot on, is how the construction and conception of home by one people can be, you know, imagined as inimical to the flourishing of other people, right? And so one of the questions I was asking myself as I was reading is, to what extent, you know, so home in a sense is a metaphor for a kind of moral imperative that you're talking about. And I was thinking about, in the Christian tradition, other metaphors. You know, the kingdom of God is one, but, you know, Martin Luther King kind of reimagines the kingdom of God as the beloved community, which offers a kind of different model than the metaphor of home, though I think it kind of is connected to, you know, what you're doing with home. And so I was just wondering about that, because I was really compelled by this sense that, you know, that you do a really good job of noting that kind of migrants and immigrants are searching for home, but that also the people who deem themselves native or citizen also are kind of feeling their quote unquote home as in threat, right? And so thinking about the moral kind of implications of that was really compelling. And I stepped in, so I missed some of the earlier conversations, but I couldn't help, so forgive me if someone else already name dropped this, but in reading and listening to your presentation, Alberto, I couldn't help but think of Thomas Tweed's book, Crossing and Dwelling, A Theory of Religion, which would be germane to this entire day, I imagine, certainly to the three presentations here, because his theory of religion, so the book is Crossing and Dwelling, Thomas Tweed is, kind of bases his theory of religion on ethnographic research among Cuban migrants in Miami, and kind of develops his entire theory of what religion is around thinking about migration and thinking about dwelling in kind of both senses of the term, like a home that you dwell in, but also the kind of gerundive quality of that a dwelling is something that's in movement and in flux. And if you're not familiar with him, Thomas Tweed was once at UNC Chapel Hill. So that was a theory of religion that was born out of his research on Cuban migrants in Miami, but born in buildings on UNC's campus. And so he has a chapter called Dwelling, the Kinetics of Homemaking, that I think would be really helpful for everyone. And yeah, I was going to say there's also a robust kind of critical engagement with that book in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. So don't take my word or his word for it. You should kind of enter into that conversation, but I think it would be productive for you. Finally, Joshua, so my own area of expertise is African American religious history, broadly conceived, and my work has a lot to do with the Great Migration in the 20th century. So I was really compelled by your stretching this kind of way that we imagine Black migration into the 19th century, and the kind of linkage of westward North American migration to eastward African migration to Liberia, right? And so kind of connect it, so thinking of migration not just as something that stretches from the 19th century into the 20th century, but also one that stretches from North Carolina going east across the Atlantic and then west across the United States. So I was, the main thing that I want to encourage you to think about as you're moving into it's cool to hear that you're moving into the dissertating process or the prospectus process. So one thing I'd encourage you to think about is to not simply think about kind of geopolitical knowledges on the one hand and religion on the other, but to think of, and I already hear this in what you're saying as far as engaging Charles Long's notion of what religion is, like to think about these impulses as in and of themselves religio race making acts, right? And so there I'm drawing on Judith Weisenfeld's notion of religio race making. So I think of, of course, the kind of Black biblical metaphor of Exodus in the Exodusters, but I'm also thinking about the kind of Ethiopianist impulse of some of these movements that was central, certainly to kind of migration to Liberia, but I think also kind of infused in this movement generally. I'm sure you've already got it on your list or read it or taken good notes on it, but Eddie Glaud's book on Exodus is a great source for this. And so, yeah, I think that for me, I can't wait to read the dissertation and then the book of all of your works. But for your work, Joshua, I think thinking about, thinking about this as and Charles Long will help you do this, as a religious act, or as a religio-racial act, right? As one that you can't separate one from the other. But as integral is really exciting and promising. And so anyway, I'll be quiet, but this is all very exciting and I appreciate the work that all of you are doing.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was really wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and start the closing remarks up now, but if anybody wants to stick around to continue the conversation, they're quite welcome to do so. So I just wanted to say a few words before I hand it back to Malachi. Just thank you all for a profoundly insightful and thought-provoking conversation. I just wanted to thank Malachi, our faculty sponsor, once again, Julie, our conference coordinator, who's also done such a wonderful job sort of moderating the chat and hosting the Zoom meeting. I wanted to thank also our faculty responders, Susan, Malachi, Bruce, and Matthew. And once again, I just wanted a round of applause, both for the, I've sort of conflated the two, and I'm sorry for this, but I'd like to have a round of applause both for our most recent panel and for all of our presenters at once right now. And I wanted to thank everybody in the group just once again for being so game throughout the past year, for all the countless Google surveys that you filled out to get the meeting scheduled, as well as this conference. And I just wanted to say it's just been an honor to be exposed to all your research and watch it evolve over the past year. I'm going to turn the floor back over to Malachi at this point.
So all that remains for me to do is actually to thank Ilza for her coordination throughout the year and today of the conference, to thank everyone who came here today for a wonderful conference, which is an end to a wonderful year that was, remember, under very unusual conditions, under the COVID conditions, but we have made a virtue out of necessity, and we have had international participations, and that's absolutely great, and let us continue that in the future. Those in the audience who are interested in the work of our fellows, you're encouraged both to keep in touch with them, and there will be op-ed pieces that are going to be published and that are available, and that you can find how our panel participants address some crucial issues on the public agenda today. Let us hear from you. Let us hear if you would like to be contacted about more programs of the Religions and Public Life Initiative. A good end to the academic year, a wonderful summer, and we shall see you here next year, if not before that.